The guards change at 11. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists press against iron gates, cameras raised. Inside, chandeliers burn in rooms the size of cathedrals. The year is 2025. The British monarchy still occupies palaces built centuries ago, funded by taxpayers, protected by law. Intouchable. But walk through Europe and you'll find something different. French palaces are museums. Russian palaces were stormed. German castles sold to pay debts. Austrian estates carved into apartments. Across the continent, royal homes fell to revolution, bankruptcy, and time. Only Britain survived intact, not by accident, not by divine right, by calculation, by adaptation, by decisions made in closed rooms while crowds gathered outside. This is the story of how the British royal palaces survived when every other castle fell. This is the story of survival. Not of kings and queens in the way you might imagine, but of buildings. Stone and mortar that outlasted empires. Palaces that bent without breaking while the world around them fractured. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington Palace, Hampton Court, the Tower of London. These are not just royal residences. They are fortresses that withstood centuries of political upheaval, economic crisis, and social revolution. They watched monarchies across Europe collapse. They survived 2 world wars. They endured protests, bombings, and the slow erosion of royal power itself. But survival came with a price, and that price was paid by people whose names you'll never learn. The servants who scrubbed marble floors at dawn. The groundskeepers who maintained gardens the size of small towns. The taxpayers who funded restoration after restoration while their own housing crumbled. The architects and engineers who performed invisible miracles to keep these aging giants from falling apart. The palaces survived because someone decided they should, because deals were made, because wealth was concentrated, because labor was exploited in ways both obvious and subtle, because the British establishment understood something their European counterparts did not. You can keep a palace if you're willing to change what it means. What the tour guides don't mention is this. These buildings stand because of choices. Choices about who matters, who paye, who remembers, and who is forgotten. This is the complex, morally tangled story of how the British royal palaces survived while every other castle fell. Stand in the staterooms at Windsor Castle and look up. Gilded ceilings stretch toward heaven. Portraits of monarchs line walls covered in crimson silk. Chandeliers hang like frozen waterfalls of crystal. Every surface announces one message: power. These palaces were never built as homes. They were built as weapons. Architectural declarations that the people inside were chosen by God, protected by stone, and utterly separate from everyone outside the gates. In the 1600s and 1700s, when most of Britain's royal palaces took their current form, display was strategy. If you wanted to rule, you had to look like you deserved to rule. The palaces were stages, and the performance they hosted shaped the nation's understanding of who had authority and why. But even the most magnificent stage requires maintenance, and as the centuries passed, that maintenance would become a burden that threatened to bring everything down. The logic was simple and brutal. In an age before mass media, before photography, before universal literacy, how did a monarch convince millions of people they had never met that they deserved absolute authority? Through architecture, through scale that overwhelmed, through materials that announced wealth beyond comprehension, through spaces designed to make visitors feel small. Windsor Castle began as a Norman fortress in the 70s, built by William the Conqueror to control the Thames Valley and intimidate the defeated Saxon population. The original structure was military, pragmatic, a Motte and Bailey castle of earth and timber. But over centuries, successive monarchs transformed it. Edward III spent the equivalent of tens of millions of pounds in today's currency to create a palace that rivaled anything in Europe. Stone replaced wood, towers rose higher. The Chapel of St. George, completed in the early 1500s, became a cathedral-scale demonstration of royal piety and power. Buckingham Palace followed a different trajectory. Originally a townhouse built for the Duke of Buckingham in 1703, George III purchased it in 1761 as a private residence. His son, George IV, had grander ambitions. He hired architect John Nash to transform the house into a palace worthy of an empire. The project, begun in 1826, was scandalously expensive. Nash added the iconic facade, the grand staircase, and staterooms dripping with gold leaf and marble. Parliament balked at the cost. Nash was dismissed. George IV died before completion. But the palace stood, a monument to royal excess that became the primary London residence of the monarchy. Hampton Court tells perhaps the clearest story of architecture as power. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey built the original palace in the 1510s, and it was so magnificent that Henry VIII grew jealous and essentially forced Wolsey to hand it over. Henry expanded it into one of the largest palaces in Europe, with more than 1,000 rooms. The Great Hall, completed in 1534, features a hammer-beam roof that soars nearly 60 feet. The astronomical clock in the inner courtyard tracked the sun, moon, and stars, announcing that the king commanded not just earthly power but cosmic knowledge. Every element served the performance. Throne rooms positioned the monarch above eye level, forcing subjects to look up. Approach sequences guided visitors through progressively grander spaces, building awe with each step. Long galleries allowed the court to promenade, to see and be seen, to participate in the theater of hierarchy. Even the art was strategic. Portraits of monarchs in armor, in coronation robes, surrounded by symbols of divine favor, reinforced the message. These people are not like you, but stone and gold require constant care. By the late 1700s, the bill was coming due, and the people paying it were starting to ask questions. Walk through the public entrance to Hampton Court, and you'll follow a path designed for spectacle: grand staircases, soaring ceilings, rooms that open onto rooms in carefully choreographed sequence. But turn down the wrong corridor, push open an unmarked door, and you'll find something else. Narrow stairs, low ceilings, plain walls painted institutional green. This is the servants' route, the invisible architecture that allowed the palace to function while keeping the workers out of sight. Every royal palace in Britain contains two buildings, the one tourists see and the one that made the first building possible. Servant quarters tucked into attics and basements, service corridors threading behind the walls, kitchens buried underground, far from the dining rooms they fed. The separation was total and intentional. The architecture enforced a class system so rigid that even the staircases knew their place. Understanding this division is essential to understanding how the palaces survived. Because when crisis came, when revolution threatened, the people who kept these buildings running had no reason to defend them. The design was deliberate. At Windsor Castle, servants used more than 50 separate staircases, each one narrow, steep, and hidden from view. These stairs connected the service areas in the basements and attics to every floor of the palace, allowing staff to move invisibly through the building. A maid could carry coal to a bedroom fireplace, a footman could deliver a meal, a valet could retrieve clothing, all without ever appearing in the corridors used by the royal family or their guests. Buckingham Palace perfected this system. When the palace was rebuilt in the 1820s, architect John Nash designed an entire network of passages behind the staterooms. Servants could travel from the kitchens in the basement to bedrooms on the upper floors without being seen. The corridors were lit by dim gas lamps, later electric bulbs, and decorated with nothing. No paintings, no carpets, just bare floors and whitewashed walls. The message was clear: these spaces did not matter. The kitchens at Hampton Court, built in the 1530s during Henry VIII expansion, reveal the scale of invisible labor. Located in a separate building connected to the palace by covered walkways, the kitchens contained more than 50 rooms. Massive fireplaces, each large enough to roast entire oxen, dominated the space. Scullery maids worked in rooms blackened by soot, scrubbing pots in water heated over coal fires. Cooks labored in suffocating heat, preparing meals for hundreds of courtiers. The food traveled long distances to reach the dining halls, often arriving lukewarm despite elaborate systems of chafing dishes and covered platters. At Kensington Palace, servant quarters occupied the attic spaces under the roof. Rooms were small, poorly ventilated, and sweltering in summer, freezing in winter. Multiple servants often shared a single room. Privacy was non-existent. A lady's maid at Kensington in the 1890s described sleeping in a room with 3 other women, rising at 5 in the morning to light fires before the princess woke, and working until 10 at night. Her wages were £20 per year, roughly equivalent to £2,500 today, barely enough to save anything after basic expenses. The architectural separation extended beyond circulation. At Windsor, the servants' dining hall was located in the basement, far from the family's dining rooms. Staff ate in shifts, their meals timed around the needs of those upstairs. Senior servants, butlers, and housekeepers ate slightly better food at a separate table, reinforcing hierarchy even among the workers. This system was not unique to Britain. European palaces operated on similar principles. But in Britain, the architecture of separation became so refined, so efficient, that it allowed the palaces to function seamlessly. The illusion of effortless luxury depended entirely on labor that remained unseen. The workers understood this. They knew their place was invisible. They knew the beautiful rooms they cleaned and maintained were never meant for them. And when the time came to defend the system, many would remember. 1789 Paris. The Bastille falls. Within months, the French monarchy is fleeing Versailles. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette will lose their heads to the guillotine. The palace that symbolized absolute royal power becomes a museum, its rooms ransacked, its treasures scattered. Across Europe, monarchs watch in horror. The message is clear: palaces are not safe. Power is not permanent. Walls cannot stop a revolution. In London, George III reads the reports from France with mounting dread. Britain's palaces, grand as they are, rest on the same foundations as Versailles: concentrated wealth, visible inequality, a ruling class that claims divine authority over people who have none. If revolution can come to France, it can come to Britain, and indeed it nearly does. Food riots, political protests, calls for reform that sound increasingly like calls for abolition. The palaces stand at the edge of a cliff. What saves them is not military might or royal genius. What saves them is calculation, a slow, grudging process of adaptation that will take more than a century and cost more than anyone wants to admit. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Britain in the 1790s was not so different from pre-revolutionary France. A tiny aristocratic class controlled vast wealth and political power. The working poor, who comprised the majority of the population, had no vote, no representation, and little hope of improving their circumstances. Enclosure Acts had driven farmers off common lands. Industrialization was creating urban poverty on a scale Britain had never seen. The gap between rich and poor was widening into a chasm. The French Revolution inspired immediate panic among Britain's ruling class. Political radicals like Thomas Paine published works arguing that monarchy itself was illegitimate. The Rights of Man, published in 1791, sold hundreds of thousands of copies and called explicitly for representative democracy. Corresponding societies formed in London, Manchester, and other cities, groups of workers and intellectuals discussing French revolutionary ideals and debating whether similar change was possible in Britain. The government responded with repression. The Seditious Meetings Act of 1795 banned large gatherings. Habeas corpus was suspended, allowing authorities to imprison suspected radicals without trial. Spies infiltrated political societies. Printers who published radical pamphlets faced prosecution. The message from the Crown and Parliament was clear: revolutionary thought would not be tolerated. But repression alone could not guarantee survival. George III ministers understood that France's monarchy had fallen partly because it refused to reform. Louis XVI had clung to absolute power until it was too late. Britain's establishment, watching from across the Channel, made a different calculation. They would reform just enough to release pressure, just enough to make revolution seem unnecessary. The process was glacial. The Reform Act of 1832 expanded voting rights, but only slightly. Middle-class men gained the vote, working-class men did not. The Corn Laws, which kept grain prices artificially high to benefit landowners while the poor starved, were not repealed until 1846, after decades of protest. Each reform was presented as generous concession when it was actually strategic necessity. The palaces survived because the people inside them understood timing. They gave ground when they had to. They made symbolic gestures, opening gardens to the public on certain days, reducing the most ostentatious displays of wealth during periods of particular hardship. Queen Victoria, ascending in 1837, presented herself as modest and dutiful, a deliberate contrast to her extravagant predecessors. The image was carefully cultivated. The reality was more complicated. What Britain's monarchy grasped, and France's did not, was this: you can keep your palaces if you're willing to share the story of why they should stand. Not the power, just the story. By 1800, Britain's royal palaces face a problem no amount of gold can solve indefinitely. They are falling apart. Windsor Castle's medieval walls leak. Buckingham Palace, purchased by George III in 1761 as a private residence, is cramped and outdated. Hampton Court's Tudor chimneys crumble. The Tower of London sinks into disrepair, and every repair costs a fortune. Stone must be quarried, transported and carved by hand. Roofs require copper or lead. Windows demand handmade glass. Heating systems, still primitive, devour coal. The labor force needed to maintain even one palace runs into the hundreds. Maids, footmen, cooks, grooms, gardeners, masons, carpenters, engineers. Each one draws wages. Each one represents ongoing cost. The monarchy's income, tied to crown lands and parliamentary grants, cannot keep pace. Estimates from the period suggest that maintaining the royal palaces consumes more than 10% of the crown's annual revenue. And that's just maintenance. Renovation and expansion cost exponentially more. The arithmetic is unforgiving. Without significant change, the palaces will either bankrupt the monarchy or collapse into ruins. The question becomes, what are you willing to sacrifice to survive? The numbers were staggering. Windsor Castle alone required a permanent staff of more than 300 people during the early 1800s. Accounts from the Lord Chamberlain's office show annual wages exceeding £15,000, equivalent to roughly £1.5 million today. But wages were only part of the equation. Coal consumption at Windsor during winter months reached 20 tons per week. The castle's heating system, a warren of fireplaces and primitive ducts, was spectacularly inefficient. Rooms remained cold despite the constant fires. Smoke damage blackened ceilings and walls, requiring frequent repainting. Buckingham Palace presented different challenges. George IV's ambitious renovation, begun in 1826, spiraled out of control. The original budget was £200,000. By the time George IV died in 1830, costs had exceeded £500,000, roughly £50 million in modern terms, and the palace still was not finished. Architect John Nash was dismissed in disgrace. His successor, Edward Blore, completed the work on a reduced budget, but the damage to the monarchy's reputation was done. Parliament and the public viewed the project as proof of royal extravagance, at a time when ordinary families struggled to afford bread. Hampton Court's problems were structural. Built in stages over centuries, the palace was an architectural patchwork, Tudor sections mixed with Baroque additions from William III's reign. The result was a maintenance nightmare. Roofs built using different methods required different repair techniques. Drainage systems from the 1500s no longer functioned properly, causing water damage in cellars and ground floor rooms. The famous Great Vine, planted in 1768, required dedicated gardeners just to maintain it. The Tower of London, the oldest continuously occupied royal palace, suffered most acutely. Its medieval foundations, built on marshy ground near the Thames, were slowly sinking. Walls cracked, towers leaned. The structure required constant attention from stonemasons who worked in conditions that were difficult and dangerous. Records from 1820 show that repairs to the White Tower alone cost more than £8,000, and those repairs were incomplete. Engineers warned that without major intervention, sections of the tower could collapse within decades. Maintenance was not just about preserving buildings. It was about preserving an image. A crumbling palace suggested a failing monarchy. Every visible crack, every broken window, every weed-choked garden path became evidence that royal power was in decline. The stakes could not have been higher, but the money simply was not there. Something had to give. Queen Victoria ascends to the throne in 1837 and inherits the crisis her predecessors could not solve. The palaces are still bleeding money. Public sentiment toward the monarchy is mixed at best, hostile at worst. Calls for abolition have quieted but not vanished. Victoria's answer, shaped by advisors who understand the changing political landscape, is radical for its time. Open the palaces. Not as homes, but as museums. Let the public see the treasures inside. Charge admission where possible. Frame the palaces not as royal property, but as national heritage. The strategy is careful and controlled. Certain rooms open. Others remain private. Tours follow prescribed routes. Guides tell stories that emphasize history and artistry, carefully avoiding mention of cost or labor. The monarchy begins to position itself as guardian of culture rather than hoarder of wealth. It works. Partially. Visitors come. Revenue trickles in. The palaces gain a new justification for their existence. But the compromise carries a hidden cost. Once you open the doors, you can never fully close them again. The public now has a claim on these buildings, and that claim will grow stronger with every passing decade. The first palace to open was Hampton Court. In 1838, just 1 year into Victoria's reign, the decision was made to allow public access to Henry VIII's former residence. The palace was no longer a primary royal residence, making it easier to transform into a historical attraction. Tickets were free initially, though visitors had to apply in advance, and tours were heavily restricted. Only certain rooms were accessible: the state apartments, the Great Hall, and the Chapel Royal. The rest remained closed. The response exceeded expectations. Thousands applied for tickets. On opening days, crowds gathered at the gates. For working-class Londoners who had never seen beyond the palace walls, the experience was transformative. They walked through rooms where kings had dined. They stood beneath hammer-beam ceilings that soared toward heaven. They saw tapestries, paintings, and furnishings that represented wealth beyond anything in their own lives. But the tours were choreographed to reinforce specific messages. Guides, carefully trained, emphasized the historical and artistic significance of what visitors saw. They spoke of Tudor craftsmanship, of the genius of architects like Christopher Wren, of the cultural importance of preserving these treasures for future generations. What they did not mention was cost. They did not discuss the servants who maintained these rooms, the ongoing expense of keeping the palace from falling into ruin, or the fact that public funds were now subsidizing what had once been purely royal extravagance. Windsor Castle followed in 1845, though access was even more restricted. Only the state apartments were opened, and only when the royal family was not in residence. Visitors paid a small fee, ostensibly to cover the cost of guides and maintenance. The money was modest, but symbolically important. The public was now contributing directly to the upkeep of a building they had been allowed to see. The Tower of London, already functioning partly as a tourist attraction due to its role as home to the crown jewels, formalized public access in the 1850s. Admission fees were introduced. The yeoman warders, the ceremonial guards known as beefeaters, began offering tours. The tower's dark history, its role as a prison and execution site, became part of its appeal. Visitors came to see where Anne Boleyn had been beheaded, where the princes in the tower had vanished, where traitors had awaited their fate. Victoria understood what her predecessors had not. The palaces could survive if they became useful to the nation, not just the monarchy. But usefulness came with strings. The public, once invited in, would expect a say in how these buildings were maintained, funded, and used. The doors, now opened, could never be fully closed again. September 1940. German bombers darken the London sky. Buckingham Palace takes a direct hit. A bomb crashes through the roof, explodes in the palace chapel, and leaves a crater the size of a drawing room. King George Vecchi and Queen Elizabeth narrowly escape. The attack is strategic. Hitler knows that destroying the palace could break British morale, but it has the opposite effect. The King and Queen refuse to leave London. They tour bombed neighborhoods. They meet families sheltering in underground stations. The palace, damaged but standing, becomes a symbol of resilience. The wars expose the palace's vulnerability in ways peace never did. They are not fortresses. They are targets. Their size makes them impossible to hide. Their symbolic weight makes them magnets for attack. During both world wars, the royal family must decide: flee to safety or stay and risk everything. They stay, but staying requires sacrifice. Wings of the palaces are converted into military offices. Treasures are evacuated to secret countryside locations. Rationing applies even to the royal kitchens. The palaces survive the wars physically intact, barely, but their meaning has shifted. They are no longer untouchable symbols of divine authority. They are vulnerable, mortal, and dependent on the very people they once ruled over without question. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times during the Second World War. The September 1940 attack was the most serious. The King and Queen were in residence. Windows shattered, walls cracked. The chapel, a Victorian edition, was gutted. The Queen's response became famous: "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The statement was both genuine and strategic. London's working-class neighborhoods had been devastated. The monarchy needed to show solidarity, but the reality was complicated. While the palace was hit, the royal family spent most nights at Windsor Castle, 20 miles west and far safer. The princesses Elizabeth and Margaret remained at Windsor throughout the war. Even in shared sacrifice, the royals had options ordinary Londoners did not. Windsor became a wartime fortress. Treasures from London museums were stored in its vaults. The crown jewels were hidden in a secret location beneath the castle. Barbed wire surrounded the grounds. Anti-aircraft guns positioned on the roof. During World War I, the family even changed their name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, severing German associations. Hampton Court suffered damage from a V-1 flying bomb in 1944. The blast struck Fountain Court, destroying windows and damaging stonework. The Tower of London, near the docks in East London, was surrounded by devastation but escaped major damage. During World War I, 11 German spies were executed by firing squad within its walls. The wars changed everything. Palaces could no longer stand apart. They had to participate, to prove their relevance. The image of Buckingham Palace's bombed chapel appeared in newspapers worldwide. The monarchy's survival now depended not on divine right, but on public perception. They had to seem vulnerable, relatable, part of the national struggle. The performance worked, but it came at a cost no accountant could measure. The story of the palaces is incomplete without the people who kept them alive. At the height of the Victorian era, Buckingham Palace alone employs more than 300 servants. Windsor Castle requires nearly 400. Kensington Palace, Hampton Court, and the Tower of London add hundreds more. These are not abstract numbers. They are human beings working 6 days a week, often more than 12 hours a day, for wages that barely cover rent and food in London's expensive housing market. Maids rise at 5 in the morning to clean fireplaces before the royal family wakes. Footmen carry coal up narrow service stairs, dozens of trips daily, their backs bent by middle age. Cooks work in basement kitchens so hot that fainting is routine. Laundresses scrub linens in water heated over coal fires, their hands raw from lye soap. Groundskeepers maintain gardens that stretch for acres, planting, pruning, and weeding in all weather. The hierarchy below stairs is as rigid as the one above. Senior servants, butlers, and housekeepers enjoy relative comfort and respect. Junior servants live in cramped attic rooms and eat leftovers. All of them understand that dismissal means unemployment with no reference, a death sentence in an economy with no safety net. These people saved the palaces. Not through grand gestures, but through relentless, invisible work. They scrubbed the marble. They polished the silver. They kept the machines running, and history barely remembers their names. The wages tell the story. In the 1890s, a scullery maid at Buckingham Palace earned between £12 and £16 per year. A housemaid earned £18 to £25. The palace butler commanded £80 to £100. A scullery maid's annual wage was less than what a skilled tradesman earned in 3 months. Positions at the palaces were considered desirable because they offered steady employment, meals, and accommodation. Housemaids at Windsor Castle cleaned more than 100 rooms. Each fireplace had to be swept, ash removed, coal laid for the next fire. The work left hands blackened and lungs filled with coal dust. Footmen at Buckingham Palace carried coal from basement stores to upper floors, climbing the equivalent of 50 flights of stairs daily, hauling 40-pound buckets. Kitchen work was brutal. The main kitchen at Windsor operated 18 hours a day. Cooks worked over open fires in rooms reaching 100 degrees. Scullery maids washed dishes in near-boiling water. Burns were common. A former kitchen maid described the work as hell on earth, but stayed because the alternative was unemployment. Laundry destroyed hands. Palace laundries processed thousands of pieces weekly. Everything washed by hand in water, mixed with harsh lye soap. Laundresses' skin cracked and bled. Rheumatism was nearly universal. Servants lived under constant threat of dismissal. A maid caught speaking to a male servant without permission could be fired. Pregnancy meant automatic termination. Dismissal without a reference made finding another position nearly impossible. These people saved the palaces. When budgets tightened, when survival was uncertain, servants kept the buildings functional. They made the beauty possible. And when they retired, broken in body, they received small pensions that barely covered rent. History recorded the names of kings and architects. The servants disappeared. In 1760, George III makes a deal with Parliament. He surrenders revenues from Crown lands in exchange for a fixed annual income called the Civil List. The arrangement is supposed to simplify royal finances. Instead, it creates a permanent entanglement between the monarchy and public funds. By the 20th century, the Civil List is controversial. Taxpayers fund the royal household's operations, including palace maintenance. The amounts are substantial. In the 1990s, public outcry erupts when it's revealed that Windsor Castle's fire damage will cost more than £36 million to repair, with taxpayers footing most of the bill. Critics argue that the monarchy is a luxury Britain can no longer afford. Why should ordinary families, struggling with their own housing costs, pay to restore gilded ceilings and silk wallpaper? Defenders respond that the palaces belong to the nation, not just the royal family, and that tourism revenue offsets the cost. The debate never fully resolves. What's clear is this: the palaces survived because the public paid for them. Not once, but continuously, decade after decade, through taxes, through labor, through the opportunity cost of what that money could have funded instead. Schools, hospitals, social housing. The survival of Britain's palaces is not a fairy tale of royal resilience. It's a story about resource allocation, about who gets to live in splendor and who pays the bill. The Civil List began modestly. George III received £800 annually, roughly £100 million in today's currency. The money covered household expenses, staff salaries, and palace upkeep. In exchange, Parliament gained control over Crown estate revenues, which were substantial. On paper, the deal favoured the public. The Crown estates generated more income than the Civil List cost. But the arrangement created a precedent. Royal expenses became a public responsibility. By the Victorian era, the Civil List had become a political flashpoint. When Buckingham Palace required renovation in the 1840s, Parliament debated whether public funds should pay for royal luxury. Critics pointed to slums in London's East End, to children working in factories, to families living in conditions of desperate poverty. Why should their taxes fund marble floors and gold leaf? Supporters argued that the monarchy represented national prestige. A shabby palace would embarrass Britain on the world stage. The debate intensified in the 20th century. By the 1970s, the civil list had grown to £980,000 annually. Palace maintenance consumed additional millions through separate parliamentary grants. The Treasury provided funds for urgent repairs, heating system upgrades, and structural work. The total annual cost of maintaining the royal palaces exceeded £10 million by the 1980s. Then came November 1992. Windsor Castle caught fire. The blaze destroyed 9 principal rooms and damaged 100 more. Initial estimates placed repair costs at £40 million. The government announced that taxpayers would cover the bill. The public response was immediate and furious. Britain was in recession. Unemployment was high. The National Health Service faced budget cuts, and taxpayers were being asked to restore the Queen's private apartments. The backlash forced a compromise. The Queen agreed to open Buckingham Palace to summer tourists, using admission fees to fund Windsor's restoration. She also agreed to pay income tax for the first time in her reign. The symbolism mattered as much as the money. The monarchy was acknowledging, finally, that public funding came with public accountability. But the core issue remained unresolved. Even with tourism revenue, the palaces required ongoing taxpayer support. In 2012, the civil list was replaced by the sovereign grant, a new funding mechanism tied to crown estate profits. The palaces still received public money. The formula just changed. The palaces survived because successive governments decided they should. Every pound spent was a pound not spent elsewhere. That choice, repeated across centuries, kept the buildings standing while other national needs went unmet. November 1992. Windsor Castle is burning. A spotlight ignites a curtain in the Queen's private chapel during routine maintenance. Flames spread through the medieval roof timbers, dry as kindling after centuries. 9 principal rooms are destroyed. The northeast corner of the castle, including St. George's Hall and the state apartments, is gutted. The fire burns for 15 hours. More than 200 firefighters battle the blaze. The damage is catastrophic, the worst disaster to strike a British royal palace in modern history. But Windsor is not alone. Hampton Court suffered a major fire in 1986. Kensington Palace has faced repeated flooding from aging pipes. The Tower of London's medieval foundations continually shift, cracking walls and requiring constant intervention. These buildings are old. Stone fractures, timber rots, lead roofs corrode. Electrical systems installed in the 1800s spark and fail. Plumbing from the Victorian era leaks behind walls, causing damage that goes unnoticed until it's catastrophic. Nature is patient. It doesn't need revolution or bombs. It just needs time. And time is the one resource even the wealthiest monarchy cannot buy. Every year, the palaces require millions of pounds in maintenance just to prevent collapse. After the Windsor fire, the question becomes unavoidable. Is it worth it? Should Britain keep pouring money into buildings that demand endless care? The answer ultimately is yes, but the cost keeps rising. The Windsor fire started at 11:30 a.m. A restorer's lamp touched a curtain. Within minutes, flames raced along the private chapel's wooden ceiling into Brunswick Tower, then into St. George's Hall, a room 180 feet long with a timber roof from the 1360s. That medieval timber, bone dry after 600 years, burned like paper. Staff and firefighters formed human chains, passing artworks and furniture out of threatened rooms. The Queen arrived while the fire still burned, watching from the grounds as smoke poured from windows. By morning, 115 rooms had been damaged. 9 were destroyed completely. The restoration took 5 years and cost £36.5 million. Craftspeople rebuilt St. George's Hall using green oak, medieval joinery techniques, and hand-carved details matching the original. The work was magnificent and a reminder of fundamental vulnerability. Hampton Court's 1986 fire destroyed parts of the King's apartments, built by Christopher Wren in the 1690s. Restoration required specialists in Baroque plasterwork, a dying craft. The cost exceeded £5 million. Kensington Palace faced different threats. In 2008, a burst pipe flooded state rooms, damaging historic wallpaper and wooden floors. The Victorian-era plumbing had corroded. Replacing it required tearing into walls without damaging fragile surfaces. The Tower of London's problems were structural. Built on marshy ground near the Thames, medieval foundations were slowly sinking. The White Tower showed measurable movement. Walls cracked, doorframes shifted. Stabilization required underpinning foundations, costing millions. These were symptoms of a larger truth. The palaces were aging faster than they could be repaired. Every fix revealed 10 more problems. Nature was relentless, and the cost of fighting it was becoming impossible to justify. The Windsor Castle fire forces a reckoning. The repair bill is enormous. Public patience with royal expenses is thin. Queen Elizabeth II makes a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. She agrees to pay income tax for the first time in the monarchy's history. More importantly, she agrees to open more of the palaces to paying visitors to help fund their upkeep. Buckingham Palace's state rooms, previously closed except for official functions, open to tourists each summer. Windsor Castle increases its tour offerings. Kensington Palace reinvents itself as a museum focused on royal history, particularly Princess Diana. Revenue soars. By the 2010s, the palaces are generating tens of millions of pounds annually from tourism. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages the art and treasures inside the palaces, becomes financially self-sufficient. The model works. The palaces now justify their existence not through royal authority, but through economic impact. They are job creators, tourist attractions, symbols of British heritage that draw millions of visitors and generate billions in economic activity. But the transformation raises uncomfortable questions. If the palaces survive because they're profitable, what happens when they're not? If their value is economic, are they still royal, or have they become theme parks? The line between preservation and commodification grows harder to see. Buckingham Palace's staterooms opened in August 1993, less than a year after the Windsor fire. The timing was deliberate. Admission fees would fund Windsor's restoration. Tickets cost £8. The palace expected modest interest. Instead, demand overwhelmed expectations. In the first summer, more than 400,000 visitors toured the palace. Revenue exceeded £3 million. The tours were carefully controlled. Visitors entered through the ambassador's entrance, climbed the grand staircase, and passed through 19 state rooms. Each room was roped off. Photography was forbidden. The experience was dignified and profitable. Windsor Castle expanded access. After the fire, the restored St. George's Hall opened to tours. The semi-state rooms, previously private, became available during winter. Annual visitor numbers exceeded 1 million. Admission fees brought in more than £20 million yearly. Kensington Palace underwent the most dramatic transformation. After Princess Diana's death in 1997, the palace struggled to define its purpose. In 2012, it reopened as a museum dedicated to royal history. Exhibitions explored Queen Victoria, Princess Margaret, and Diana. The approach was modern, experiential, designed for social media. Visitor numbers doubled to more than 400,000 annually. The Royal Collection Trust, established in 1993, managed the monarchy's art and treasures. The collection included paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer, furniture by Chippendale, and items valued in the billions. The trust organized tours, published books, and mounted exhibitions. By the 2010s, it generated more than £20 million annually in surplus revenue, all reinvested in conservation. The economic argument became irrefutable. A 2017 study estimated the monarchy contributed £18 billion annually to the UK economy through tourism. The palaces were the centerpiece, creating jobs and drawing international visitors. But the transformation came with costs. The palaces were no longer primarily royal residences. They were attractions. Buckingham Palace's staterooms felt less like a home and more like a museum. The line between preservation and performance had blurred beyond recognition. not every British royal property survived. Across the country, dozens of castles and estates once owned by the crown now lie in ruins or have been sold off to private buyers. Nonsuch Palace, Henry VIII Renaissance masterpiece, was demolished in the 1600s for building materials. Clarendon Palace, a medieval favorite of English kings, crumbled into ruins and was forgotten. Dozens of smaller royal hunting lodges, manor houses, and fortified residences vanished completely. Why did these fall while Buckingham and Windsor survived? Location mattered. Properties close to London retained political relevance. Symbolic weight mattered. Windsor Castle's connection to medieval kingship made it too important to abandon. But most of all, resources mattered. The properties that survived were the ones the monarchy chose to fund. Every pound spent on Buckingham Palace was a pound not spent on a crumbling castle in rural Yorkshire. The palaces that stand today are not the ones that were strongest or most beautiful. They are the ones that powerful people decided were worth saving. The rest were allowed to fall. Their ruins, scattered across the British countryside, are monuments to a different kind of choice. The choice to let something die so something else could live. Nonsuch Palace was Henry VIII's attempt to outdo France's Château de Chambord. Built in Surrey between 1538 and 1541, it featured elaborate stucco decorations, gilded turrets, and ornamental gardens. Contemporary accounts described it as England's most spectacular palace. Henry spent more than £24 Savazero on construction, equivalent to roughly £12 million today. After his death, the palace passed through various owners. By the 1680s, it was falling into disrepair. In 1682, the palace was demolished. Stone and timber were sold as building materials. Today, nothing remains except archaeological traces. Clarendon Palace near Salisbury was a favorite of medieval kings. Henry II added it in the 1160s. Henry III added a great hall and chambers with painted tiles and stained glass. But by the 1500s, Clarendon was neglected. The roof collapsed. Walls crumbled. Local residents scavenged stone. By 1650, it was a ruin. Today, only foundations remain. Richmond Palace in Surrey was another casualty. Built by Henry VII in the late 1400s, it was one of England's grandest palaces. Elizabeth I died there in 1603. After the English Civil War, Parliament ordered Richmond demolished in the 1650s. A few buildings survived as private residences. Whitehall Palace in central London was the monarchy's primary residence from 1530 to 1698, covering 23 acres with more than 1,500 rooms. In 1698, fire destroyed most of it. Only the banqueting house survived. The rest was never rebuilt. Geography played a role. Nonsuch and Clarendon were far from London. Richmond and Whitehall fell during moments when the monarchy lacked resources to rebuild. But the deeper reason was choice. After each loss, someone decided whether to rebuild or abandon. Windsor and Buckingham were chosen. The ruins remain, evidence of what survival costs. The British royal palaces survived. That survival is presented as triumph, as evidence of continuity and national pride. But survival is not free. It never is. Every year, the palaces consume tens of millions of pounds in maintenance, security, and staffing. Those funds come from taxpayers and tourism revenue. They represent resources that could have been allocated elsewhere, to schools, to hospitals, to social housing in a country facing a housing crisis. The palaces survived because a choice was made again and again across centuries to prioritize them, to protect them through revolution, war, fire, and financial crisis. But every choice involves trade-offs. The money spent on gilded ceilings was not spent on reducing child poverty. The labor devoted to maintaining royal gardens was not available to improve public parks. The political capital used to defend the monarchy's funding could have been used to expand social services. This is not an argument for or against the palaces. It is simply the acknowledgement of a truth, often left unspoken. The palaces stand because someone decided they should, and that decision had consequences. for the people who worked in them, for the taxpayers who funded them, for the country that shaped itself, in part, around the belief that these buildings mattered more than other needs. The survival of the British royal palaces is a story of resilience, yes, but it is also a story about priority, about what a nation decides is worth preserving, and what it decides is worth sacrificing. The numbers are stark. In 2022, the sovereign grant totaled £86.3 million. Of that, £51.5 million went to palace maintenance. Buckingham Palace alone is undergoing a 10-year renovation expected to cost £369 million. The work is necessary. Electrical wiring from the 1950s poses fire risks. Victorian plumbing leaks, asbestos needs removal. But £369 million is also the annual budget of a mid-sized hospital trust. The trade-offs are invisible but real. In 2022, Britain faced a cost of living crisis. Food bank usage reached record levels. The NHS struggled with waiting lists exceeding 7 million. Social housing was at its lowest point in decades, and £51.5 million went to buildings most Britons would never enter. Defenders argue the palaces generate economic value. A 2017 study claimed the monarchy contributed £1 billion annually. But critics note that France's palaces, fully open as museums with no monarchy, attract more visitors. Versailles alone draws 10 million annually. The economic argument may not be as clear-cut as supporters claim. The labor cost is equally significant. Maintaining the palaces requires thousands of workers. Conservators, masons, electricians, gardeners. These skilled professionals could be deployed elsewhere. Every hour restoring Windsor is an hour not spent repairing schools or upgrading public infrastructure. The political cost may be highest. Every debate over palace funding is a debate not happening about other priorities. Parliamentary time spent on the sovereign grant is time not spent on housing, education, or healthcare. This is not to argue that preserving historic buildings is worthless. Cultural heritage matters, but meaning has a price, and that price, paid over centuries, shaped Britain. The palaces survived. The question is, what didn't?